Thanks, Gabriel, also for pulling this together and for doing the introduction. I'm going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, but I'll be guided by you. And please, if you have questions as I go, very happy to take them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about my educational history and my career history, because they obviously intersect. As per the introduction, I've got quite a varied career. I've done a lot of different things, and I think that just shows you what you can do with economics. There's a lot of different opportunities. I'm then going to do a bit of a case study into some work that I'm doing right now. As Gabriel said, I'm currently working on national competition policy. It's probably the biggest part of Australia's macroeconomic reform agenda right now. There's been some really interesting decisions, even in just the last week, when the treasurers all got together virtually, hosted in Brisbane, and made a number of decisions about how we're going to take forward the Australia's reform agenda. So quite an interesting time. So I might just quickly talk about my career journey. So I graduated a fair time ago now, like at the beginning of the 2000s, and I went straight from high school to University of Sydney. And I studied a pure Bachelor of Economics, where I majored in economics and econometrics. I also then did the optional fourth year, which was the honours year, and graduated with first class honours. That was particularly important because it meant that I was able to secure that role with the Reserve Bank of Australia. So the Reserve Bank of Australia was my first graduate role in economics. It's obviously quite a well-known institution in Australia, responsible for Australia's monetary policy, and makes obviously a lot of news because of its role in targeting a cash rate, which has a flow-on effect to the interest rate structure in the economy. I can talk a bit about more of that later if there's an interest. I then went from the Reserve Bank of Australia after about 18 months. I was decided to make a bit of a career change, and I pursued a role in financial markets. I did that through Westpac's financial management arm, and I basically became a portfolio manager with partial responsibility for about $4 billion in funds under management in the superannuation schemes. So that was quite an interesting role, gave me good exposure to financial markets. And I worked on that for about another 12 to 18 months before I decided to take up an opportunity to spend some time overseas and have a little bit of a career break, because I'd gone straight from school to university. And that was a really important time, because I sort of thought about what I was going to do with my career, and I decided actually I was quite interested in the prospect of teaching. So when I came back to Australia, after about 18 months overseas, I went back to university and did a graduate dip ed, which is a way of becoming a teacher as a mature age student. I did that at Macquarie University in Sydney. Now, then I went on to become a high school teacher for 7 years. And at that time, I taught economics, legal studies, history, geography, business studies. So I had a sort of broad humanities focus, but very much economics was my main focus, and I did a lot of teaching of Year 12 and Year 11 economics in New South Wales. After that 7 years, and coinciding with the birth of my son, I decided actually to take another break and a pause, and I realized that I was really missing kind of being at the coalface of economics. So I took that opportunity during that time to take some leave without pay from my employer, and I went overseas to Sweden, and I studied at Sweden's oldest university, which is called Lund University. And I did a master's in economic history, which was a really interesting sort of counterpoint or point of difference with my undergraduate degree in economics, because it gave us a lot of historical context about the history of economic thought and the application across time. And that course really sort of spanned about 1,000 years of economic history, and it was extremely interesting. When I came back to Australia following graduating that master's, I decided to move to Canberra, and I applied for a role at the Department of Prime Minister in Cabinet. I got that role, and I was to join Cities Division, which at the time was under Malcolm Turnbull, former Prime Minister, and they were sort of responsible for pursuing what was called the Cities Policy Agenda. Before I arrived in Canberra, that particular function was moved to the Department of Infrastructure, which is where actually I began my career. So I worked after that period of time for 3 years in infrastructure. And in that time, I did a really broad range of policy opportunities. So I worked on Australia's first population policy. That was under Prime Minister Scott Morrison. I also worked on a range of transport-related issues, including rail and road transport. Even did some projects in the arts, because arts is actually in that portfolio as well. So really broad diversity of topics in that particular one. I then took an opportunity for what they call a secondment to the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and I joined at the time what was called the Deregulation Taskforce. And basically, that was the genesis of my current career. And I spent the last 5-6 years with more or less the divisional head, who has been sort of my sponsor, more or less, in terms of my career in recent times. So I followed that role and that opportunity from PM&C to the Department of Finance, and then when that particular division head moved across to Treasury, I also followed him. Just prior to moving, I was the policy lead on the Robin Kruk review, which was a review into the movement of international health practitioners, looking at their registration and accreditation and how we could make that journey easier. And that was really about focusing on getting more medical professionals into Australia. So as Gabriel said, I'm now the head of policy and reform under national competition policy. That particular function sits in an area of Treasury called Markets Group. And Markets Group is basically the area where Treasury does all its macroeconomic reform. In 2023, the government set up the competition review, and that was a review that, unlike other sort of normal reviews of government, doesn't have a notional sort of head. What it has is a group of people, experienced, very highly capable, working on an ongoing basis at looking at sort of government priorities related to competition. At the end of 2023, the government decided to launch or revitalise national competition policy. And that led to a program of work that I and others led across the next 12 months, where we essentially agreed a new macroeconomic reform agenda for Australia. And I'll talk a little bit more about why competition is the driver of that. But as you'll see from some of the news clips on the right, that has been a really big piece of work. It's got a lot of press and a lot of interest across industry and employers and unions, mainly because of its potential to deliver really transformative economic impacts in Australia. And the original decision at the end of last year in 2024, when treasurers across the country agreed, there was the Commonwealth agreed a $900 million fund to seed fund to help support states to implement reforms. And I was responsible for negotiating how that reform bucket was essentially allocated across different reforms. So I'll move on to a very quick case study. So the reason, I guess, why my role exists is that in Australia, we have a productivity challenge. It's actually a global productivity challenge. But the reason why we care so much about productivity in economics is that productivity really underpins living standards over time. Productivity is simply a measure of the amount of output you get per inputs. And so ideally, if you're going to grow over time, you're going to have to either throw more inputs at a society, or you're going to have to make more with the same amount or make more with less. And so the only really way to drive sustainable increases in material living standards is actually to grow your productivity, a nation's productivity. And the alarming thing, at least for a lot of the countries across the Western world, is that productivity has been in decline for about 30 years. In fact, it's forced Treasury to downgrade its long-run assumptions. And I know the Reserve Bank of Australia is actually now predicting a 0.75% productivity growth rate. Part of this is explained by the fact that we no longer build that much stuff anymore. we actually have moved into a lot of services, and it's much harder to increase productivity in some of the services which are growing very rapidly. One of those is the care and support economy sector. That's things like aged care, childcare, hospital. And as you can imagine, getting more with less or more of the same when you're talking about a person-to-person service is incredibly hard. What's also, you can see from the chart at the bottom, is that there's really two ways to increase productivity. One is to throw more inputs at it, so give workers more capital, more computers, more machinery, more tractors for farmers. The other way is actually to innovate, to make better use of what you've got, or to apply technology. And that is called multi-factor productivity growth. And multi-factor productivity growth, as you can see in the last sort of 3 measured periods, is really low or even negative in Australia. So that's alarming. So the reason why we were set up, I might skip this slide. The reason why we were set up is because competition is an essential driver of productivity. Competition is not an end that we pursue in and of itself. It's a process. It's probably the least cost way that governments have in terms of promoting in market structures a better allocation of resources. And if we can allocate resources to the highest value use, then we're going to help improve productivity over time. Competition is also really essential for innovation, because what we know is that it's not the actual invention of technology which is important for businesses, it's the application of technology. Now, if you think about markets, if you have an uncompetitive market where there's just a monopoly, there's one provider of a good or service, there is no real incentive for that monopolist to adopt new technologies because they've captured the market already. And that's true for other concentrated market structures. But if you have very competitive markets, then you have that competitiveness drives innovation in the sense that firms will be incentivized to try and outdo each other by adopting and adapting the latest technologies. So we can see the economic literature is really clear that when you have competitive markets, you have higher levels of innovation, you have more what economists call creative destruction. That's a process of newer, smaller, more productive firms replacing those older, slower incumbent firms, and that means that you're getting a better allocation of resources from those old firms into those new growing firms. And you have fast convergence to like that global productivity frontier, so where the world leaders are. That's important for humans, for consumers, for people, for you and I, because it means that we can support higher wages and better working conditions, and we also enjoy lower prices, higher quality, and more choice. So national competition policy, as I said, it's like we revitalized it, and we say revitalized because it's actually a 30-year-old reform agenda. Before any of you were born, about in the early 1990s, there was the Hilmer Review, and the Hilmer Review led to some really transformative reforms in Australia. You're now familiar with having choice on your mobile phone, but back in those days, most of the utilities, including telecommunications, electricity and gas, were big government-owned monopolies. There was no competition, they were slow, they weren't very productive. And so national competition policy basically said, we need to privatize these, or we need to create some competition for these, and we need to provide access so other firms can access that monopoly infrastructure that those firms enjoy. So in some cases, governments privatized their government-owned businesses, or sometimes they opened up that infrastructure so others could use it. So nowadays we have multiple choices when it comes to using telecommunications. It created a national energy grid. It led to over 1,400 140 transport-related reforms, and it was really sort of transformative. The Productivity Commission, which is Australia's independent sort of research and modelling function, estimated that we're all of us, about $5,000 better off today because of that project. So huge. As I said, last year, we revitalised that competition policy with states and territories. I won't go into much of this now, but happy to talk about it when we do questions and answers. We were again supported by Productivity Commission modelling, which helped determine the size of the benefits of the sorts of reforms that we were negotiating with states and territories. And that was really important because at the heart of national competition policy is this idea that when the states and territories undertake reform, there's an economic uplift, and the economic uplift leads to an increase primarily in Commonwealth revenues. So because the Commonwealth taxes income, taxes companies, company tax, what happens is that the Commonwealth actually benefits more than the states in terms of its tax base when we have a productivity increase. So as wages rise and as business profits rise, the Commonwealth gets basically a productivity dividend. And so at the heart of national competition policy is this idea that we share back that dividend with the states who undertook the reform effort in the first place. Because we have a federation in Australia, often the responsibility for reform or the policy levers available for policymakers exist at both the Commonwealth and the state level. In some cases, constitutionally, the states have all the levers that we need. And so the only way that the Commonwealth or this particular framework recognises that the Commonwealth can help incentivise good reform by paying the states a productivity dividend, hence that $900 million. These are some principles that that we worked on that basically have been embedded and agreed by all governments, and we're now working towards making sure they reflected in government practices. I won't go into these until maybe the questions, if there are some questions. In terms of the reforms, I can just give you a bit of a flavour of how broad they are. So we did everything from planning and zoning regimes. So this is in particular commercial and industrial planning and zoning. So this is where businesses can basically set up, how they can use the land that they're set up on, how quick it is to go through particular processes. We looked at modern methods of construction. We've done a whole bunch of projects around modern methods of construction, which is basically your prefab and modular type constructions. This is the great hope to increase construction productivity. We have really poor construction productivity. The Productivity Commission actually found that that the number of houses built today per unit of worker is about half what it was 30 years ago, which is amazing that productivity has declined in that sector. The other one of the others we've done is overseas standards, or we're working on currently with states, and we're working towards identifying a number of priority sectors. This is where basically we're trying to leverage regulatory standards or regulatory processes from around the world rather than try and create unique ones in Australia. And the reason for that is because we want to access global markets. We want Australian businesses to be able to operate seamlessly with those markets. And we also want to be able to import as consumers those products without having to go through extra regulatory hurdles in Australia. We have a right to repair scheme, which is we're reviewing right now and looking to expand to things like consumer electronics and also agricultural machinery. And that's basically allowing anyone, not just the original manufacturer, the ability to repair those goods or services. And again, that's about competition, creating competition in repair markets. And then finally, one of the last original reform we're looking at is a national worker screening check. And that is basically an entry requirement to operate in any occupation related to human services, so those care and support economy sectors. And at the moment, they're all different by sector and they're all different by states. And so having a single check just helps provide more seamless movement of people between jobs and across state borders. Excitingly, in only the last week, the government has announced sort of further reforms, including expanding this reform agenda to look at heavy vehicle road reforms and a road user charge. Now that's all sounds pretty complicated, but what it is really is about getting more out of the existing road infrastructure that we have and allowing trucks and cars to better access those roads and not be governed so much by regulation, but by price. We're also working on a national license for electrical occupations, but looking to also expand that out to other occupations critical for housing. And probably the other one that's big is National Construction Code, which dictates how homes must be built all across Australia, has been paused, and there's an effort now across the country to streamline that. So that's been some pretty big reforms. I might leave it there and stop sharing my screen and take any questions at this point.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much, Michael. I think that was very interesting. So I think we'll move on to the main event of this session, which is going to be, the question and answer, as well as any like advising that you guys would like. So if you have any general questions or any specific questions about anything that, Michael has discussed just then, any about his roles, or if you have any specific questions about yourself and your own situation, just raise your hand and we'll get to you. And I want to just make it clear that, like, don't be shy, and feel free to ask anything, because no question is, out of limits when it comes to planning your working lives and your future. So do we have any questions?
I've got a question.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, Michael. So, you talked about a lot about boosting competition and things and how there was a lot of privatization. But even with privatization, especially in like natural monopoly sectors like telecommunications or like electricity, there's still been like I wouldn't say like a monopoly, but like a dominant provider like Telstra or CBA that like still now has like a significant competitive advantage. And why do you think that's happening? Like, how could we work to like make this better?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I've just gone back to my principal slide. So it's absolutely true that some markets display sort of natural monopoly features. By that they mean basically it's hard for more than one firm to compete because the fixed costs of setting up business is so high. So if you think about telecommunications, especially back in the old days, when you had landlines, there was telecommunication wires running all around the country to every single home. Now we have more mobile phone towers doing that instead, or even satellites. But the cost of that infrastructure is really, really high. And so to duplicate it, to have another company come in once that other company is already established and try and take market share, you can think the cost of setting that up is in the billions of dollars. So what governments did in the 1990s is they tried to open up that infrastructure to competitors. So Telstra itself was privatized, and Optus came on the scene initially. Now we have a lot more providers, but one of the really important changes or two really important changes that were done at that time and continue to exist to this day is that there was a commitment by governments that they would compete on a level playing field with private businesses. So this meant that if you enjoy the advantage of being a government-owned monopoly, you wouldn't exploit that at the cost of private business. The other one was that this access principle, right down the bottom, access to significant infrastructure. So, of course, someone like Telstra, if they build the infrastructure network, they do deserve a return on that. It's costly, it's very costly, but that should be on reasonable terms and prices so that other firms can essentially access that infrastructure and use it, pay Telstra a return on their investment, but then use that to compete in the market. So you have like these wholesale retail type models. Now, that has had like as you've noted, like different success in different markets. I would say telecommunications is relatively competitive. Other areas less so. We have often moved into sort of like a wholesale retail model where there's basically one or two providers in the wholesale market, and then there's a bunch of firms accessing their infrastructure and selling it in retail markets. It's not just direct competition that matters for prices and quality of services provided by these companies. It's actually just this idea of contestability. So if the businesses that operate that market feel like there's a reasonable, credible threat that someone could come into that market and steal their market share, that is usually enough to ensure that that business will try and continue to innovate and to offer better services to consumers over time. So competition economists, microeconomists like myself, we don't just care about seeing how much competition, like how many firms, we're also interested about how easy is it to access that market. So the barriers to entry and exit. A great example in Australia is also aviation. We haven't had any government, flyers in Australia for many years since Qantas was privatised. but there's been carriers coming in and out of that market for a long time. So even though the market is relatively concentrated, when someone fails, or someone like Ansett fails, there's usually somebody comes in and takes its place. As a economist, though, we'd like to promote more competition. So there are ways you could increase competition in the aviation market, for example, by allowing foreign carriers to come into the country and operate in Australia without having to set up a domestically domiciled presence here. So there's more opportunities to increase competition. They have trade-offs, and that's the sort of things as policymakers you need to think about. Hope that helped.
Yep, thank you.
Anything else from anyone?
Anne.
Hi, I was wondering, like going back to the beginning of your presentation when you talked about like universities and like how you got to the economic path you're on right now. I was wondering, like, is there any like preferences if you want to get into like the finance industry for like different degrees and stuff? For example, like differences in like Bachelor of like Commerce versus like Bachelor of Economics and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So economics, like having economic literacy is really important, I think, if you want to join the finance industry. It's also important if you want to sort of do some sort of government policy making role. Economics is the language of commerce and the language of policymakers. So it is true that there are specialized degrees at university, like a bachelor's of commerce, specializing in areas like finance. And if your goal is, to narrowly always work in those sectors, then that might be what you want to do. Usually those degrees include at least 1 year of economics. What I would say is that finance essentially is an application of economic principles. Economics gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of where you might choose to go in your future career. And so given how important it is and how central it is to how, I guess, all markets, or understanding how markets work, understanding how government thinks about policy and how government determines policy, it really is useful to have economics as well as some of that finance, those finance units or those commerce units. I mean, as you can see from my own career journey and my education journey, there is opportunities to obviously continually go back to university and do additional units. And I think this idea of micro credentials, picking up new learning over time, is growing in terms of its importance. I don't know anyone that I work with who hasn't gone back and done at least like a master's degree or some sort of graduate units, even if it's like at an open university. Some of the big universities around the world, including places like Harvard now, offer sort of individual units you can do. And so everyone is kind of interested in this lifelong learning thing because it does really help you keep current with your job. But as I said, I worked in financial markets myself. I only did one finance unit in the whole time I was at university. But that general economics does serve you well. But certainly finance is an application of economics, which if you're looking to take that first and direct step, then it obviously is helpful. I hope that's helpful. Anne, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, going on from that, like, you know how you mentioned your like major and your like major choices and like I think it was major and minor choices. Like, does that make a big difference in like what sort of like jobs you can get once you like get out of uni?
So if you have an idea of who you want to work for, especially what you want to do, I would look at what they and I talk to them about what they sort of expect. My experience is if you want to work at a place like Reserve Bank of Australia, almost everyone there is an economics graduate. Like they have done an honours, they have to do an honours in economics. If you're talking about Treasury, it's more of a mix between economists and lawyers. There's quite a few lawyers at Treasury because Treasury does the bulk of legislation in Australia. It's actually responsible for a huge amount of legislation. So there's a lot of lawyers. Having said all that, I also work with extremely successful economists who have no formal economic training They came through a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of International Relations or Bachelor of Science, and they had an interest in economics, and they've picked that stuff up either on the job or they've done those sort of micro units over time. So I think that the important thing is to pick something that you know you're going to stick with or be able to stick with and stay enthused about, because that's the thing that I think employers will see about you. Like if you're doing well, you're enthused by what you're studying and you can talk about it in an enthusiastic way. I think if someone recognizes that you're smart, you're enthusiastic, there are ways that you can learn stuff on the job. So I'd pick units that you think are probably most likely to be the things that you find interesting and that you can do well in, and have some idea of what your employer, your future employer, or your set of future employers might be interested in terms of that. And you can go and ask them. Like you can go and try and set up. You could speak to the HR departments, or if you know someone who works there, you could just go and ask them. Or set up a coffee catch up and say, what was your career journey like? What units did you do? What are the people that you work with? What's their educational background?
Thank you so much.
No dramas. Mimi.
Hi, I just had a question about how important do you think your education background is in helping you achieve your career success today?
Yeah, and look, as I said, I mean, the fact that I did pure economics, I've done undergrad, I've got honours, and I've done a master's in economic history. All of that stuff is obviously really relevant and vital for my day-to-day work. The reason probably for my success is I've got a very well-developed economic framework, and a lot of my job is very quick. I have a lot of broad responsibility of those reforms we talked about before. I'm looking at multiple different issues. So in a single day, I might be shifting between like standards reforms to occupational licensing reforms to considering something in the housing space. And what is the superpower for someone in a policy role is to have a very clear framework and be able to be sort of hypothesis driven in the way you think about problems. So if you have a good, strong educational background in the area, that obviously helps you come up with answers. A lot of the work I do can be really quick turnaround. So the minister's office might request a piece of information with a turnaround of a couple of hours, or my boss will come to me and ask me, do you know the answer to this question? And I'll need to sort of come up with an answer on the spot or write. Again, though, I've got a lot of colleagues who don't have as much economics as me and are great economists. So it's more an interest in the subject matter and a willingness to do some broad reading, because economics is actually relatively intuitive once you get to the sort of, you've got the core pillars of economics. So I would say, again, choose something that you're interested in. I would think everyone could benefit from at least 1 year of economics at university, the micro, macro subjects, just to get some of the core principles. But what you do beyond that, it's not totally essential if you want a career in a sort of economics area or an economics adjacent career field. Did that answer your question? Who was next? Was it Neil?
Hello.
Hey, Neil.
I just have a question regarding when you were working with in Parliament with Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison. Like, you obviously work with both the Labour and the Liberal Party, so I'm assuming you weren't affiliated with any of them. So I'm just wondering what your like specifically what your role was.
Yeah. So just to be clear, I'm a public servant or a bureaucrat, if you want the kind of common language term. So I wasn't working directly for Malcolm Turnbull or Scott Morrison. I work in the public service. So the public service is independent of the government of the day. It's meant to be providing frank and fearless advice, is the phrase. And so we don't serve like a political party. We serve the public interest. That's why it's the public service. And so one of the really important things, if you do want to work in government, is to kind of, everyone obviously has political sort of biases or interests, and that's fine. But when it comes to coming to your day job and when you turn up for work, my job is to basically help the government deliver on its agenda. And so that means that under a coalition government, they'll have certain priorities, and my job is to essentially help them execute their priorities, or to help deliver their priorities. But the independence part of the public service comes in is that we do provide a lot of advice to government. So I, on a week-to-week basis, will have meetings with the ministerial officers. So the Treasurer's office is my current main source. So I don't talk to Dr. Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, directly myself. He's not interested in talking to me. That's for people much higher up than me, like the Secretary of our department. But I do talk to his advisors. So someone like Treasurer Jim Chalmers would have many, many advisors across different areas of specialty. And so we have a competition advisor, or he has a productivity advisor, or a couple of productivity advisors, and they are the people I talk to mostly on a sort of day-to-day or week-to-week basis. The other ministerial office I talk to a lot is Assistant Minister Andrew Lee, he's a real big brain and got some great ideas, and he's an assistant minister in the Treasury portfolio. When I was working back at Prime Minister and Cabinet, we had the same sort of role. We were there to advise the Prime Minister's office, but help the Prime Minister deliver on a day-to-day basis. All of the agencies, the departments, have slightly different functions and different roles. Treasury is that central economics department. Finance has a role especially in sort of managing government finances and trying to enforce sort of fiscal discipline. And Prime Minister and Cabinet is really there to help think about the whole of government agenda and bring together all those different departments that exist for different purposes. And so outside of those three, what they call the big central departments, there's many line or portfolio agencies that do all that sort of day-to-day stuff. There's the health department, there's an education department, there's a employment department, et cetera. So that's kind of the way that we interact with politicians. I do occasionally get to go up to Parliament and speak directly to Minister Lee, for example, or brief him, but that's not typically the way you do it on a day-to-day basis. It's more their advisors.
Thank you.
No dramas. Raphael.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could go into the specifics of, the application of economics, how they differ in careers across like government, the private sector, and if you're like familiar as well as like academia.
Yeah. Look, it's a really hard question to answer because like economics is essentially like a master key that unlocks so many different professions. As I said before in answering another question, like economics is like the common language of policymakers. It's one of the most important sort of skill sets or areas of knowledge for government. So in my role, most of the people who do policy development or policy work or have responsibility for reviewing policy work from other departments have economics or some experience with and dealing with economics and economic frameworks. When it comes to private sector, it depends obviously what role you have. Like if you're interested in working directly in finance, a lot of people have economics or at least or a commerce or finance degree. And then you look more broadly, economics is sort of like one of those sort of general degrees that you could access a lot of different jobs, because economics, more so than probably almost any other degree out there, helps you understand or gives you a framework for understanding opportunity cost, trade-offs, and that's a really useful skill in business, full stop. In terms of academia, I have done as I said, 3 different degrees. I briefly considered a PhD when I was at Lund University because I got offered a position. I would say, academic economists have a very different sort of role or have a very different focus than, I guess, policymakers or applied economists. So you'll hear from one, if you stick around later, I think there's a professor talking. We often, as policymakers, work with academics to help guide. They often are sort of thought leaders, or they have very specific areas of expertise. I have one of my closest friend at university from my undergrad degree. He went on to after he came with me to the RBA. We were at the RBA together for a couple of years, And then he decided he was going to go back to University of Sydney. He did a master's in mathematics, and then he did a PhD at Yale, and he was the top of his class at Yale, and now he's a professor of economics at Oxford University. So, you know, like often people change their mind in their career, as I have done several times. But the general path to going through an academic career is to do your undergrad, do get a first class honours, and then get offered a position either in the PhD program or you go via a master's degree. Hopefully that's helpful. You got any follow-ups?
Nah, that's it. Thank you.
No dramas. Alice.
Hi. I was wondering about your economic history course. It sounded really interesting, so I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on what exactly it is and how it's applied to your career.
Yeah, it was super interesting. I enjoyed it a lot more than my undergrad degree. So Alice, are you doing economics at high school currently?
Yes.
Yeah. So what you do at university in a sort of undergrad economics degree is more or less a continuation of what some people might call the neoclassical synthesis, which takes like neoclassical, neoliberal ideas about markets and how they work and kind of synthesizes it with sort of Keynesian ideas of economics around how to manage aggregate demand. So your macro and micro courses are more or less built around the neoclassical synthesis ideas. What you miss, unless you do, say, political economy at your university, is that there's a whole other ecosystem of different schools of economic thought. Going back to the first classical economists like Adam Smith and Ricardo, even Malthus, all the way through to Marx and Marxian economics, and then the various iterations of Keynesian economics, and then the rival sort of what they call the Austrian school of economics, which kind of underpins a lot of the early thinking in pulling back that neoclassical, that orthodox economics field into sort of monetarism in the 80s, 70s and 80s. So the thing interesting about economics is it's been around kind of as a school or a discipline for about 300 years. And what is been true the whole time is that people's ideas keep changing. I mean, economics is not a pure science. It doesn't pretend to be physics, or like people try to make it like physics with sort of mathematical identities and rules. And it doesn't work because we're studying human beings here. We're not studying sort of mathematical laws or laws of the universe. And so economics is really about trying to understand and describe human behavior. And so our understanding of that is sort of evolving over time, all the time. The degree I did in Sweden in economic history, I found fascinating. It was a real focus on the growth of the East Asian countries in the 20th century. So, I mean, a lot of the countries that are rich today were rich prior to the 1900s. So they all went through the Industrial Revolution. They're mainly sort of the European countries. And then the question is, well, since the Europeans got rich, why didn't the rest of the world get rich? And then, so there's a real focus on, why did a small handful of countries, including Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, why did they get rich? But say the Latin American countries and a lot of the African countries didn't get rich. And there's a whole bunch of different reasons or theories about why that is. And so that's one of the areas of economic history is that's trying to understand why some nations have grown rich and some nations remain poor today, despite the fact that we seem to have like a blueprint. We should have a blueprint by now. Did you have any other follow-up, Alice?
Yes, thank you. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, so I would say, Alice, economic history in Australia is not that common. If you want to study economic history, you can do political economy, and that's kind of like a precursor course. And a lot of universities in Australia do offer that. Otherwise, universities always offer exchanges. And the Europeans, the UK universities and the US universities have much bigger and stronger economic history departments. The university I went to had a discrete economic history department, as opposed to there was an economic department and then there was an economic history department alongside it. That just never happens in Australia. So that was really interesting for me to have that. So yeah, I would explore opportunities to do sort of like an exchange for a semester or a year overseas if you're interested, or do your postgrad studies overseas.